Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining myself and Sylvia in our presentation. We are going to be talking about using nature to support young children affected by trauma. The learning objectives for today's presentation, we will be talking about understand the impact of trauma and what it looks like in young children, define trauma-informed care classrooms and early childhood nature-based education, and identify strategies and share resources on using nature to support trauma in young children. Introductions. So my name is Diona Williams. I'm also known as Dee. I have studied early childhood education along with early childhood special education. I have a master's in education and a master's in organizational management and human resources. And I've been in early childhood education for 18 plus years. I've worked in early intervention. I did infant toddler mental health, special needs preschool teacher, currently a professor at Tohono Community College, and I'm owner operator of a nature-based preschool in Southern Arizona. So part of picking this topic today, after doing many years of working in behavioral health and studying infant mental health, I've definitely learned and gained an understanding of the importance of trauma-informed classrooms in especially as being a special needs preschool teacher, but most importantly, like how to incorporate nature into that space as well. So I'm hoping today, those of you that are listening or watching this presentation, that you'll gain some tools that'll hopefully help you in your classroom. If you're experiencing any students that may have a history of trauma.
Hello, my name is Sylvia Collazo. I will also be joining the presentation today. I am a doctoral candidate in special education at Florida Atlantic University, focusing my research. My specialization is in early childhood, and my research is looking at kind of the intersection between early childhood special education and early childhood nature-based learning, and how we can best support our children with different disabilities through nature-based practices. Currently, I serve as a project supervisor for a grant-funded program at the university, as well as adjunct professor for our bachelor's in early child care and education program. Like Dee, I have over 18 years of supporting young children with disabilities, their families, as well as teachers. I've been able to have the opportunity to serve in roles such as a family helper and consultant, as well as a behavior therapist, in addition to my years as a teacher, as well as an inclusion classroom or inclusion specialist, where I actually supported early childhood educators who had little ones in their classrooms who may have had different needs. Spent the last about 8 years looking at professional development and how to best prepare future teachers for the roles in supporting young children. I'm a lifelong lover of nature. I was born in a city, but I feel like my heart has always been in the mountains. And as I mentioned before, I'm looking at kind of how the research aspect of these different areas. And as you mentioned, looking at the role of trauma is really important to me as well, because having come from that world of special education primarily, we might feel sometimes that some of the behaviors that we see that are concerning may be due to a particular disability, but we have to be mindful that sometimes our children are coming in with a range of needs that might be beyond any kind of disability, but might actually be stemming from experiences that may have been traumatic. So let's go ahead and start off looking at what is trauma in young children. So when we're looking at trauma, and defining it, particularly for young children, it typically is defined as those adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that can profoundly impact a child's development across different areas and their overall well-being. This is something that can come in different forms, and we'll get into the different types of trauma in a moment. But definitely um, different types of experiences that not just kind of stay in the moment. And sometimes I know, we might have moments in our lives where something happens and it affects us momentarily. But with trauma, this is something that can have longer lasting effects. So let's look at the types of trauma. Um, there are traditionally three types of trauma. The first I'll talk about is acute trauma, and that's typically the response to a single incident or event. So that is a one-time thing that may happen. For example, let's say if a child was involved in a car accident, um, that typically, hopefully, if it happens only one time. But because of that experience, it can be pretty traumatic. Um, you also may see that with a natural disaster, be it a hurricane, an earthquake, something that really has a profound impact on their environment, can definitely be a traumatic experience for a young child. When we're then looking at chronic trauma, now this is more than just a one-time thing. This type of trauma happens as a response to repeated and long-lasting events that may be occurring in that child's life. So, for example, issues with neglect. Typically, we don't think of neglect as a one-time incident. Um, and I remember as a teacher thinking back, if I had a little one who may have come into my class, who still had uh, a dirty pull-up because mom was on a rush when putting him on the bus. So that's not quite neglect. That's just something that may happen, a one-time thing. But definitely something, if it was ongoing, if there was some obvious display of non-caring about certain issues, that would definitely be something that can produce trauma for a child. Um, you may see that also with children who may have had parents who are incarcerated, just because that may be something, unfortunately, because a lot of times once you're in the system, it's very likely that you kind of go back. So children, seeing their children kind of coming in and out of jail can be something that is traumatic for them. If we move into now complex trauma, now that we're looking kind of the compounding effects of multiple types of traumas. So in the previous slide, you kind of saw the little building blocks of different traumatic events. And that's kind of a good visual to kind of keep in mind with complex trauma, because that usually comes in when you have different things happening, maybe not at the same time, but maybe kind of one after another. So you might have children who may require medical surgical procedures, for example. It can be kind of bad enough to already know that you have a situation that warrants a medical procedure, but unfortunately, because there's so much involved with that, for example, especially for a little one going into a hospital and then having to get poked by needles and then actually undergoing a surgery and then dealing with the after effects. And what if it doesn't work and they have to go back? So it's definitely something that you might see with children who have those kinds of health needs. But also complex trauma can be the other side, where you see children who may be the recipients or witness to different types of abuse over time. So maybe it's not just a one-time incident, but it's happening multiple ways over an extended time. So now let's look a little bit at the impact of trauma. So how does trauma affect children? When we're looking at trauma, we have to keep in mind that these are negative experiences that can really have some detrimental effects to children across different areas of development. As educators, we're going to see Typically, how children's ability to learn is impacted. Their ability to remember things, to acquire new knowledge, to pay attention, to focus. These are things that we might see that they struggle with, which is going to impact their ability to really retain any kind of new information we may be trying to teach them. And along those same lines, we may also see how children may have difficulty following classroom expectations. Maybe it may appear that they're just ignoring you when you're asking them to follow directions or things like that. And it's not necessarily that they don't want to follow through, but they may be so preoccupied or impacted by whatever may be happening around them that it has created this effect on them and their inability to really follow through. We also notice that children's ability to really connect with others and build healthy attachments or supportive relationships with either their peers or with other adults can be definitely impacted. And unfortunately, with attachment, it's so crucial, in particular with our infants and toddlers, who are just then building their first connections with adults. Unfortunately, if trauma occurs early in life, it can actually have an effect in the way they're able to make those connections, which of course then impacts the way that they're able to relate to others. As a result of these impacts, we do see that children have decreased academic performance. It's really hard to do well in school where you're not able to concentrate or really focus on the things that are being taught. You also see that children are at much higher risk for being suspended from childcare because they might not necessarily be because of their academic performance, but if the impact of the trauma is affecting their behavior, unfortunately, we are seeing more and more the rates of young children who are being suspended and expelled are pretty high, even in early childhood. And sadly, some of that may be in response to the behaviors that are causing this, might be in response to trauma that we may not even be aware of. We also see, unfortunately, there's an increased likelihood of placement in special education services. So young children who may be coming into our programs, if you're already in a program that serves children with special education, sometimes it kind of helps to look and explore a little bit about the background as you start looking at some of the social emotional history of the children that we serve. You find out that some of them actually do come from situations that where they were exposed to different types of trauma. Maybe it was more than just a one-time incident. Although that could be enough, I don't want to lessen the impact that acute trauma may have. For example, a one-time incident could be losing a parent, and that in itself can be something sufficiently traumatic to impact a child's life. So just to kind of go back to the types of trauma that we talked about earlier, any type of trauma that a child experiences can really have a global impact. And unfortunately, sometimes that can carry into, because it carries into their learning experiences, it may appear as if they're now having these educational challenges, which may lead them to this type of placement.
So I wanted to provide an example of what Sylvia was sharing with us here. So prior to starting Outback Learning, I was in public education. I was a special needs preschool teacher. And my last year in that role, I'll never forget, I had quite a few professionals that were coming into my classroom, whether it was a behavioral specialist, occupational therapist, speech language pathologist, along with the principal. And each and every individual that came into the class, both my AM and PM class, had expressed that I had the toughest group of students in the entire program. And our program was collectively on 2 campuses in 10 classes combined as a total. And part of what they had realized as a team is that both of my classes, I had several students that had experienced a severe amount of trauma. It was not just acute, it was complex, and therefore, most of my time I remember in that first semester was trying to keep the entire class safe from a handful of students. And so when that's happening as an educator, part of what I remember doing is going home and reflecting, what could I do to not just the fact that I knew that the students were not getting what they needed academically, but how could I support the students that um, any part of our daily routine in class, it seemed like one student had a hard time with transitions, the other student needed more structure. Um, but there was just so much decrease in academic performance overall for the entire class. And then I think the other part that was really troubling with one student in particular, um, the principal had made a decision to suspend the student. And so, as a special needs preschool teacher, I was often put in a position where it was really difficult. I was advocating for the student to make sure that they had the services that they needed, that they couldn't be isolated from being around their peers, and also suspending the student was really inappropriate too. But because the district that I was working for at the time, it just didn't have the supports for to create trauma informed classrooms. And so part of what I want to make sure that I mention is that in your districts or whatever state or place that you're residing in, you can always look up early childhood mental health consultations. This was not an option for the area that I reside in, but I definitely know if I would have been able to contact someone to maybe come in and observe what was going on, and not from just a behavioral standpoint, but just understanding that some of my students in the classroom was experiencing some severe trauma, that maybe we could have increased the academic performances. Maybe I would have had less students being suspended at the age of 4. And I failed to mention that at the time, my classrooms were considered self contained. So there were 16 students, and out of 16, I had 15 students on IEPs and one typical peer. So, in other words, students were already they already were receiving IEP services at that time. Um, so it's really important to know what kind of resources are out there to support you as an educator, um, to ensure that everyone's safety is in place, but most importantly, we're there to educate students, but also providing a nurturing and safe environment.
So maybe some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, what if I don't serve these children? I don't work in a special education classroom, or I don't have children who have had trauma. Um, the fact of the matter is that 26% of the children in our country will witness or experience a traumatic event before they're 4. Um, that's more than a quarter of our children. So I'm sitting there thinking about even just Dee's classroom, for example. She shared that she had 16 children. Um, 4 of those or more, um, statistically speaking, would have been children who would have experienced some type of traumatic event, and that may have been acute, chronic, or complex. Um, So those are things to really keep in mind, that even if as educators we may feel like we sometimes try to shelter ourselves and maybe work in a place that maybe it seems safer, or it seems like, oh, but or maybe we're working in a program where we're serving children who may come from our affluent families. Those children are included in the statistic as well. And we do know that trauma definitely can span children from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of financial situations. So nobody's going to get left out of this. Unfortunately, we're all going to be in that position as early childhood educators. One of the things that's been found in research that in our roles, you're more likely to encounter a child who has experienced trauma daily. So that's not something that we're ever going to be able to escape, which is more of the reason why we want to make sure that this information is available and out there for all of you, because it's something that it's going to be encountered. So what we do with it is really what we need to think about. And I know in this particular slide, for those of you who may be listening in, you see kind of a little girl kind of with a sad, maybe a little frustrated or face buried in her hands, kind of almost like in a pensive state. And unfortunately, this is something that we may see sometimes with our children, that they just kind of retreat to themselves a little bit and may not know what to do next, which is what makes our roles so important, because we're the ones who want to make sure we have the tools and resources we need to be able to help and support them through whatever it is that they're going through. So what does that look like in young children? So as I noted earlier, the picture with the little girl that those of you who are watching may have noticed, you're going to see different types of behaviors in children who have experienced trauma. And typically we may see them, we may categorize them as internalizing or externalizing behaviors, with internalizing being behaviors that are happening more kind of on the inside, not necessarily things you always see. And then externalizing are the ones that definitely are much more visible in the classroom. So for internalizing behaviors, we might see children who are quiet or timid and shy, maybe kind of expressing themselves similar to the little girl in the picture I described. I think back to a young child in my classroom years ago, who didn't say very much. He did have some difficulty with communication, but he actually had some really good words. He just really didn't say them very often. He tended to keep to himself. And if I back up a little bit, I mentioned before I worked in the special education classroom. So yes, this was a child who was diagnosed as having autism. So it's easy to say, but Sylvia, this child had autism. Of course he's going to have trouble communicating. Of course he's not going to want to socialize. But we have to be able to look kind of beyond a diagnosis and really be able to look at a child in a whole child way. There was more happening in this child's life. And unfortunately, one of the ways that I can say that I found out that there was more happening was that whenever we tried to do high fives in class, he would shy away and hide his face as soon as you put your hand up to give him a high five. And as a teacher, I have to say that was very impactful for me, because I realized that he was afraid that he was probably going to get hurt. He didn't realize that the context was that we're having fun and we're just giving each other high fives. So that also pointed out to me there's definitely much more going on in this child's life than just their challenges with communication and socializing. There's definitely something else that was going on in the background that may actually be what's impacting his difficulty with communicating and socializing with his peers. So, you may also see some children who kind of have this negative self-talk. It might be out loud, but it could be very much to themselves, which makes it harder for us to see. But they're kind of telling themselves, like, I'm so dumb, I'm so stupid, I don't know anything, that kind of thing. As I noted before, you see children who have trouble remembering or attending to things in the classroom. Sometimes, unfortunately, we might see children who they believe it's their fault. So whatever it is, whether um, it was a one-time incident, for example, losing a loved one, or even if it's something that's chronic or complex, so they're getting exposed to different types of trauma, or maybe over time, they think it's because of them, that something is wrong with them, that they did something wrong, and it's because of that this is happening. You may have some children as well who may have little to no affect, and affect is really that the ability, like that expression that you typically see on children's face, well, on anyone's face, really. Um, but I know that some things, as early childhood educators, we definitely focus a lot on emotions and helping children understand them. And children who've been impacted by trauma may have trouble really expressing different types of emotions and may kind of have a sort of a blank or flat look to them. You'll see that some children have low self-esteem and low self-confidence, um, and they may also have difficulty trusting. And I think that tends to really be tied to when traumatic events are tied to individuals that they're familiar with or they know. Um, when somebody that you thought once that you could trust betrays that trust, um, typically you're going to hesitate to trust that person again. But that also sometimes impacts your ability to trust others in the same vein, and that's definitely something we see with young children. Now, on the flip side, you might have little ones who might be externalizing some of these, um, the fact that how they've been impacted by the trauma. So you're going to see children who might be displaying more aggression or what we think of acting out. And that can really be a range. It could be from just calling out to full-fledged kind of hurting themselves or hurting others or throwing things or breaking things in the classroom. So it definitely can take a lot of forms, but it's something that's visible to you as a teacher as well as the peers around them. You may see children who may engage in verbal aggression or abuse. So they're actually, now these are not the little ones who might be talking to themselves, but they're actually talking out loud and maybe saying some ugly words to their peers, or maybe you as a teacher. If they're saying it to themselves, they're definitely saying it out loud in a way. Maybe it's tied to that physical aggression, so they might just kind of hit at themselves and saying, like, oh gosh, I'm so stupid, and just kind of pounding on themselves. And we see this with little ones. This is sometimes why we do. It's because this is the way they're responding to what may be happening to them. Then you see some behaviors that might not be as outward and obvious, but it's still something that you start hearing a little bit more from them. So you might hear children who have kind of chronic stomach pains, the little one that comes to you with a headache every day. Obviously, we do want to make sure we communicate with families to make sure that there's no health issues happening. But once health has been ruled out as a situation that may be causing this, it's important to start thinking about, well, maybe there's something else going on that might be giving them this pain. And then you also see children who may have poor skills development. So when we're thinking about different areas of development, I know we're focusing a lot on that social emotional piece because that tends to be the one that's greatest impact, that and the cognitive aspects since we're educators. But you may see that they have trouble developing across all different areas, including their own physical development.
So I also want to provide two distinctive examples for both internalizing and externalizing. Thank you, Sylvia, for sharing everything. For the internalizing piece, I'm going to share more of a personal story. So my husband and I are legal guardians of our daughter. Well, she's our daughter. And part of what we have experienced in the last 9 years, I've often said, especially doing the work of infant mental health, infant toddler mental health and now early childhood mental health. There were a lot of things that we saw as parents that oftentimes we would talk with the pediatrician about, or we were seeking out counseling as a family or for her because we were seeing a lot of these behaviors. Um, and just choices that she may have been making may not have been great choices, but like no feeling behind it. We also noticed like a lot of self confidence, low self esteem, difficulty trusting. And I'll never forget when she's 11 now. When she was about 7 or 8, somewhere in that time frame, she started experiencing a lot of, not experiencing, but she started expressing. And so I'm stressing the expressing piece because she didn't really express how she felt about things. But she would say, I have a headache. And I thought it was so strange that a young child would have a headache or my stomach is hurting. And I remember talking with the pediatrician saying, she has headaches all the time. Her stomach is hurting. What do you recommend? And in hindsight, we had no idea that these were just all signs of trauma. They're all trauma related. So I'm saying that those of you that are educators or parents or foster parents, these are things that you probably want to pay attention to because trauma is not always aggressive. It can be very silent. And as someone that has lived in this type of a situation for over 9 years, I definitely have moments where I'm like, okay, this is starting to connect and make more sense. Um, so that's internalizing. As far as externalizing, I definitely experience these things in the classroom. So I'll just share a brief story. I had a student with diagnosis of ADHD along with being on the spectrum. And pretty much from the time the student got off the bus, within 5 minutes, the aggressive behavior would start with students. And we started our day outdoors. The second it was time to transition indoors, the student had to be first. If the student wasn't first in line, um, then the person behind that student would potentially experience aggressive behavior. So there was a lot of times where myself and my para, we would try to make more accommodations, trying to make it to where that we could decrease the aggressive behavior. We weren't always successful, but we were just always trying to figure out different ways um, to make the transition smoother. But I think the most troubling time was sitting in circle time with cube chairs and the student launching a chair across the classroom and destroying the entire classroom. And if you've never heard the term of classroom clear out, that is essentially what we were experiencing with 3, 4, and 5 year olds. I share this experience because I think about during that time as an educator and the guilt that I felt that I was carrying and the shame because I just couldn't figure out what else to do. And part of it was just not having the support and resources, knowing what the student needed. But because of my role as an educator, my administrator at the time just only wanted me to focus on the education. And I think the most difficult part was knowing that I came from behavioral health and knowing that I did the work of working in infant mental health and I couldn't do anything for the student. The only thing I could do was advocating for what I knew that the student needed in the classroom. But after having several classroom clearouts and my own administrator getting hurt by the student, that's when things became very serious. I don't share these things to scare you all as listeners or those of you that are watching this presentation. I'm just trying to bring light to a situation. Hopefully, if you have experienced those things, that you're just able to walk away feeling like, okay, I'm not alone, because I very much felt like I was alone as a preschool teacher, a special needs preschool teacher experiencing such aggressive behavior in class.
Before moving forward, I'd like to thank Dee for sharing these experiences because as a fellow early childhood educator, as she's sharing her stories, and I'm sure that this is happening for some of you who are listening as well, is visualizing those same experiences in your own classroom. I am very familiar with classroom careerouts, having experienced them with my own students that I supported. Um, and that feeling of what do I do? How do I help this little one? And it's never. I know we'll probably stress this near the end as well. At no point are you ever expected to have all the answers, but I think as educators, as long as we're observant and we are taking note of what's going on and we realize that there's more to it than maybe what we might already know or be aware of, and using that information to try to get the resources that we need to try to help that child and their families as best as we can. Um, that really is the ultimate goal, is to do what we're able to do to support them. So when we're thinking about these types of behaviors that are observed, it's important to note, as Flannery said in 2019, educators of these children will notice frequent fight, flight, or freeze responses to stress. And we wanted to really focus on this because children are going to respond to different types of stressors and trauma in different ways. And it's not that they're going to necessarily choose one either. Just because there's an or there doesn't mean they only fight or only try to escape or they only freeze up. They may actually do all three in response to different situations at different times. So we just have to be aware that you're not necessarily going to have a child who's only internalizing or only externalizing. You're going to have a lot of crossovers. And if you have children who are dealing with chronic or more complex trauma, you're definitely going to see a wide variety of responses to that.
So, what are trauma-informed classrooms? Keep in mind, according to Perry, to heal or alter the traumatized brain, therapeutic interventions must activate parts of the brain that have been altered through trauma. So, in earlier parts of this presentation, I had mentioned early childhood mental health, and I've also mentioned infant toddler mental health. These are two really important pieces to mention at this particular part of the presentation, because when you're working with young children, and if you're able to have either one of these services or consultations to be able to enter into your classroom, whether you're indoors or outdoors, they can do their own observations of what's going on and work with the child and parent, and you potentially as an educator to help the child in the classroom as far as working through those traumas. I won't go into it a great deal at this point. I'll be sure to link some resources at the very end, but I also want to describe the picture that we have. We have a young, I would say a young boy, maybe he's about 5 or 6 years old, and he is curled up in the corner with his knees to his head and his arms holding his knees tightly. Um, Believe it or not, this is something that I actually did see in my classroom. And when Sylvia and I were putting this presentation together, I really wanted to make sure that we had an image that reflected what could actually be happening in the classroom. Because part of what I've seen is once, especially with students that may have aggressive behavior, when they're coming down from calming down from just having an outburst, sometimes they will, part of their process of cooling down may be just literally curling up and just trying to, like, almost trying to, like, get control of themselves or just calming. It's just another way of how I witnessed some students, how they coped. This is just one of their methods and how they cope. So the image is really powerful because you all may have witnessed this as well. Trauma-informed classrooms is an environment that promotes safety and security for all children This type of classroom approach creates a sense of security, stability, and safety. So part of what I wanted to talk about is the image that, again, Sylvia and I chose, and I intentionally chose this one. Um, I like the way the tables, the desks are set up in the classroom. Of course, the image of the nature. It gives like a calming effect to the classroom itself. But when you're creating that type of environment, of course, you're probably wondering, well, I already offer a nature environment, but what does that really mean? Um, and so part of what you want to do is you just want to make sure that the environment is calm. And part of what I ended up doing in my own classroom was I started to transition what it typically looked like um, in setting it up. It was just a traditional preschool classroom. And then over time, I started to transform it to where the colors, it wasn't as bright. I did my very best. But I also started to use the outdoors as my additional classroom. Um, Not just the indoors, but just going outdoors, I also felt like made a difference in providing the security and stability and safety that I felt that the students were needing. Um, but indoors, there were just different things that I changed. I made sure that I had furniture that was more flexible for seating. I just really relaxed the standards of what um, I would say a typical preschool classroom would have. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in further slides. What does that look like in early childhood nature-based classrooms? So part of what happened in my classroom um, is that I tried to attempt to mute the colors in the classroom, meaning not as many bright colors. I really attempted to um, adjust the lighting. So at the time, our district was going through some construction. And so they had also adjusted our lighting to where you could dim the lights. And that was a really big feature. Prior to that, you could put shades over your fluorescent lights in the classroom. And I also had some windows. So I would, myself and my paraprofessional, we would open the windows every day to bring in natural light and to bring in fresh air. We created sensory spaces. So instead of having cube chairs, like throughout the classroom, we would have like bean bags, um, primarily bean bags. But there's other options. I want to say our occupational therapist had also provided us with a really unique chair, but I don't remember the proper name for it. So flexible seating, and then sensory. I want to also say that we offered things that were soft, things that so stuffed animals. We also had Orbeez. My students love Orbeez. Some people don't really care for them, but we just wanted to provide a space where students could like feel, touch, and hear things. And then also bringing like nature items from outside into the classroom. We incorporated that into our sensory space as well. And our quiet area, well, we called it quiet area, it was more like a cool down space. And so that was a space that I introduced to the students during circle time and just explained to them, yes, while you're over there, please read a story to yourself, or you can ask myself or Miss Denise, we could go over and read with you. But this is also a safe place to feel comfortable. And we had our stuffed animals over there and pillows. It was just a nice, comfy space. Natural items in the classroom, again, I mentioned that for our sensory space, we increased those things as well. And then also what I would do when we were outdoors is I would say to the students, if they found any nature items outside that they wanted to bring indoors, we had a nature box. The kids were able to add those items and then share them during circle time. And then they could decide like where they wanted those items to be placed in the classroom. Another key piece was adding like living items. So we would have plants, and unfortunately, we only had a fish. But I think over time, if I was still in public ed, I probably would have looked into getting a guinea pig or something along the lines of that. But now, in having an outdoor program, we have chickens now, so that provides a different kind of living. But obviously, we also have the outdoors too. So in this picture, Sylvia and I really wanted to try to show you all what this could really look like in a classroom. And so Sylvia, I don't know if you want to chime in, but ultimately, when I was creating my classroom down the line, I wouldn't say down the line, but within the same year, the classroom went through another transition. Don't be afraid to change your class to adjust it to the needs of what's going on. And I'll never forget, like, I was the classroom where I felt like nothing was ever really set up. But when I tell you that myself and my paraprofessional were literally surviving every single day, we didn't have a second to breathe. Our time during our break time was really digesting whatever happened in the morning session and then whatever happened in the afternoon session, and how could we prepare and improve things and make it better. And so by the time the second semester had rolled around, I basically said, okay, Miss Denise, we're making some huge adjustments. And so I wanted to make sure that the classroom was open, and I wanted to make sure that it was welcoming. Not that it wasn't welcoming before, but we had just learned so many valuable lessons from the first semester. Um, we knew that we had to change our environment to hopefully decrease some of the behaviors we were experiencing in class. And also in that second semester, it wasn't just the classroom that changed, but my approach altogether. I really started to implement nature-based learning. And so I explained to her any part of campus where there was an outdoor space, we were going to use it. And so that meant if we went to the rose garden, to the courtyard, we might do circle time out there to read a story. If it meant we would play outside on the playground a little bit longer and then do our tabletop activity outdoors, that's what we were going to do. And then the next biggest piece that we implemented was gardening, and that made a difference too. And so I definitely can say from the first semester to the second semester, there was just a vast amount of difference in what we were doing before, because we really did not want to have any more students, or we didn't want to have any students being suspended or sent away or sitting in the office, because it just wasn't practical. It didn't make any sense. And then I also took the time to really try to educate my administrator on why we were doing outdoor learning in the first place. And I will say by the end of the school year, my administrator was, she couldn't believe, like, we didn't have to call her down to help get a student inside or anything like that. Um, and a lot of it was just, we decided that we were going to use nature and use nature as a healing piece for us and for the students. And at the end of the day, it definitely changed our approach and how we work with students with trauma. So Sylvia, I don't know if you wanted to describe the picture or share anything in regards to it.
Sure. I think it was great that you shared some of your own experiences, because some of those things are actually being reflected in the image we see here. It's kind of like an open space classroom. There's a huge circle that's designated in the middle of the ground. And I think it's interesting to note how there are children um, sitting on the circle, but there's smaller groups, and then there's some that are closer to the teachers, and some are a little bit more away. And it really does reflect the idea that we really need to think about the children's individual needs and what works best for them. I love that in this classroom image you see there's a lot of open windows, and you see the use of more natural furnishings and you see some plants. It's not a really fancy classroom. There's nothing, as you're looking through it, there's nothing really sophisticated. And I'd like to point out just some of the things that you shared, Dee, about how you decided in the second semester that you were going to, the second half of the year was going to be a little bit different. And that's something that's really important to note. That as educators sometimes, and I remember this, when you're preparing for a new academic year, you spend so much time trying to figure out how you're going to arrange your room, what are the materials you're going to have there, how's your schedule going to look like, when are you going to do this and that, and then your children come, and then you find out who they are, and you find out what their needs are, and it's okay to make those changes. Um, and if there's a point in the year where you feel like, no, I really need to rearrange things, whether it's the space that I'm using inside the classroom, or if you're using more of the outdoor spaces, or wanting to implement more of those outdoor spaces, it's okay to do that, because that's really being able to use, you're using the space to the fullest potential, but also really considering what the needs of the children are in doing so.
Thank you. So in these next two images, you'll see that there is a quiet space, and you'll see two children that are sitting what seems to be like the library space in their classroom. But they have like really comfortable pillows and a really fun like shag green carpet to sit on, and they're just reading stories. And this was definitely something that we had added into our classroom, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Although, yes, children still kind of ran through the quiet area when they felt like it, but at least there was a space in the classroom. If there were students that may have been having a hard time with the transition, they would just say, Miss D, is it okay if I go to the quiet area? Or they may not have said anything, they just went over there. And I was totally fine with either or. I actually had another student, I felt like his routine was just knowing, like, this is where I can go. Miss D is totally fine if I have my snack in quiet area, and I'm going to engage in activity when I feel like I'm centered and ready. And I thought that was really powerful because this was the same student that had a hard time transitioning into the classroom and engaging in tabletop activities, and then eventually really like circle time. But the fact that he was able to figure out, like, okay, we have a plan, and it's okay if I make these choices because I know that Miss D and Miss Denise are very supportive of what I'm needing to do. And believe it or not, like, he never missed any more tabletop activities just because we had created a space where he could feel safe. The other image is, I would say it's like it looks like a secret garden. I feel like I want to just like sit down and have tea in the space. I actually never had like a setup quite like this, but we did have access to a garden on our campus, and believe it or not, where the classroom was located, we could look out to the garden. And so I remember the first semester that my students would often like want to look out that window, and then once they realize like we're actually going out there and we can actually plant things and we're having picnic snack, like it was just such a game changer for them. So any type of outdoor space, even if you don't have a garden, maybe there are other options on your campus that you could utilize. I would just try to utilize whatever you can. Any kind of nature space that you have access to, try to utilize it to your best of your ability. Sylvia, did you have anything that you wanted to say about this image as well?
One of the things I really wanted to point out is really the simplicity of both images. Even the one to the right that is more outdoors and it seems to be kind of complex looking because you see some plants and there's kind of an arch. Um, but really, if you look at the details, it's something really, really basic that they've kind of basic little things that they've really just created a really awesome, cozy space for children. Because you just have it's really just an arch, and the only thing that really makes it kind of a space is that it's propped up against the wall. So now you have almost like that little cave, secret cave space. Um, but they just have like little plants and just little throw pillows and just simple things. They can just really create that comfortable space that children may just need, whether it's inside or outside. Um, and you see that as well in the indoor picture with just, some big body pillows and a shag carpet. Um, Kind of have those little bit brighter colors, but still subdued. So that's something that maybe I don't know if we touched too much on when looking at some of the other images. But I know it's one of the things that you mentioned as a feature in a trauma-informed classroom, the idea, not just the lights being kind of dimmed down as needed, but also the colors that we use. I think in early childhood, we tend to lean towards those bright, fun, Crayola crayon colors that are more of the preschool look, but sometimes our children really just need more of those softer colors that are a little bit more calming. And that's one of the nice things about incorporating nature into our classroom is the fact that those kind of come naturally, is those more natural colors.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sylvia. Strategies and resources on using nature to support children affected by trauma. Let's stop and talk about COVID-19. So when Sylvia and I decided to do this presentation, this was pre-COVID-19. And there's no way that we could talk about trauma-informed classrooms without talking about current events of what's going on. The intent of this slide is not necessarily to say like what you should do or not do, but hopefully to just prepare you in what types of conversations you may be having with parents and whether it's with your staff or even just with your own family. So one of the key things that we want to talk about is coming back and opening your programs. I've talked with many providers where I reside in Arizona, and there are providers that have remained open during this entire pandemic, and there are some providers that have closed and then reopened, and then there's people like myself that have closed and have not opened at all. And so these are just conversations that myself and many early childhood educators are talking about. And some of that conversation is whether we're talking about policies and what we're doing or supplies or how we're feeling, but just creating some sort of a support system, I think is really important to do at this particular time. As you all know, every day there's something new, it appears to be when it comes to COVID-19. So if you're able to create some sort of, and I'm just going to piggyback off of the Tucson area, there's a provider that started an early childhood education coalition. And I was so excited that I actually met her via Zoom this past weekend. And I'm an hour away from Tucson, but the fact that I can be a part of a conversation about what's happening, I think it's really important to stay connected. So having conversations, you may have families that want to talk about it, give them the space and time to, and reassure them and listen. That is really important to do because families, there are families that are having to make some really tough decisions as far as whether they're going to stay home, whether they're going to homeschool their child. Is it going to be safe? There's just so many questions that families have. And as we're feeling stressed or not feeling stressed, it's really important that we don't pass these things on to our families and that we just try to be present and be reflective in our practices. And hopefully we may not have all the answers, but hopefully it'll just ease potentially some of the anxieties that families may be feeling. And then also, like I've mentioned throughout this presentation, and Sylvia as well, is seek out early childhood mental health consultants in your area. That is really important. If your area has any kind of early childhood mental health consultants, I feel like they're a great support. They were a great support pre-COVID-19. And I definitely feel like in moving forward, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about there are children that didn't get to say goodbye to their peers, to their teachers. There was no closure. Everything was very abrupt. And so this goes back to some of the things that Sylvia mentioned early on in the presentation. That could potentially be an acute trauma for some children and for some families. So those are just things to keep in mind. Sylvia, did you want to add anything to this piece as well?
I think we really touched on all the points that I think were important. I couldn't stress enough the idea that we really do have to be mindful as we're coming back and opening programs. If you're coming from a program that didn't continue to stay open, is the fact that a lot, if not all, our children are going to be coming in with some form of trauma in response to the pandemic. And just being mindful that now we talked a little bit about statistics, and again, yes, like you mentioned when we started this, there was no COVID-19 to be thinking about. But now that it's here, it is definitely part of our lives, and all of us have been impacted by it in some way or another. So have our children. So just really coming in and being mindful of that, I think is going to be what really helps us moving forward.
Thank you. So strategies for supporting children. Using techniques to support children's self-regulation, which would be like mindfulness, breathing exercises to help calm their system. And so part of what was interesting when I was still in the classroom, the campus I was on, at one point about 10 years ago, they got a grant to get smart boards for every classroom. And I will say I'm one of the very few teachers. I'm not going to say I don't like technology. I think it serves its purpose. And at the time, I was given a suggestion to use, I think it's Go Noodle. I believe it's Go Noodle. I could be quoting that wrong. But anyways, on this website, they have a tab for mindfulness. And it was so interesting. I looked through it before I shared it with the students, I looked at, well, what do they have to offer? Because part of it was just like self-regulating. And I will tell you, the students fell in love with doing the mindfulness techniques right before we would do any circle time. We would do mindfulness. And they had the opportunity to melt like an iceberg, and it was talking about breathing exercises and how to calm them. And it was just so engaging for them. And obviously, if I'm in the classroom, that's a tool that I could use. But definitely, if I was outside, one of the activities that our occupational therapist had did with the students was like animal yoga. And so we would pretend like we were a seal, but we had to move our bodies in like a yoga stance. So there's different tools and resources out there where you can either use these techniques with technology indoors, or you can use these techniques outdoors as well. And there's really a lot of great books that you can read to children that offer some of those mindfulness pieces as well. I understand that children make sense of their experiences by reenacting them in play and through interactions with peers or adults. This is really important, and I'm quite confident those of you that have been doing this work for a really long time, you understand the importance of play. Those of us that have maybe come from more of a traditional setting. I don't want to say like my administrator at the time, she definitely understood the importance of play, but part of what I felt like myself and my fellow colleagues, we really had to advocate the importance of why the children needed time to play. And not that academics was not important, absolutely, it was very important. But when you're working with children, whether they have trauma or not, um, play is their work. And so that's really important to have that piece. And part of what I advocated for at the time was like understanding we will be outside more to have more playtime. Um, and we will still have the academic pieces. Those are still big. They were still a very big piece of our program, but how it looked, it was very different. I'm sure that some of you all are familiar with the emergent curriculum, and that was more of the approach that I tried to implement. Obviously, as a public educator, there's still some restrictions there, but if nothing else, I just wanted the students to have more time to play and work those things out. And then lastly, being nurturing and affectionate, but also sensitive to children's individual triggers, allow the child to decide if they want to be nurtured. This is so important. It is so important to keep this in mind. I know as an early childhood educator, you know, I would make the choice of like, oh, let me give you a hug, or just like suggested things. And part of what I learned in doing infant toddler mental health work was really teaching the child that they have that choice and that power to decide if they feel they want to be nurtured versus me as an adult coming in and saying, oh, let me give you a hug, as if they don't have a choice. Because some children may not want that. Maybe they just want a high five. Maybe they want to do a pound out or whatever the choice may be. But I think it's important that we give them that choice and that power, because you never know. Some children don't like the feeling of being touched. And part of what I learned, even for myself, I I realized like, yeah, I'm not really a hugging type of a person, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to feel loved or nurtured, but how I want to feel in those types of interactions, I was able to create boundaries for myself, which then in turn I was able to do that with children as well. So it's just really important to try to teach children that they have a choice. So
So a few more strategies to keep in mind include using positive guidance to help children. And I think Dee did a really great job sharing some examples of things that you can do to really support children and kind of working through some issues and just being aware of where they're coming from, where their preferences are. We're approaching them, interacting with them to make sure that we're meeting them at meeting their needs where they're at. And then we also even want to kind of step back and think about some of the things that we typically view as best practices for supporting children in general can be very effective, in particular for little ones who might be dealing with trauma or the effects of trauma. So really creating and maintaining those daily routines in the classroom. And I know for some nature-based programs, some of them tend to be a little bit more open and child-led, and I am by no means discouraging giving children that flexibility and that ability to really seek out their own adventure, let's put it that way, outside or with nature. But for those children who maybe have not had the opportunity, unfortunately, in their lives to really have something that's consistent, maybe for them, and it could be something, it's an accommodation that's really made for an individual child, is kind of giving them a little bit of a layout of things that they can expect for that day or things that they can work on. So that way they feel like they have kind of a routine they can rely on, and it's something that it's consistent for them. On that note, really giving children a heads up if something changes, so that say you do already have an established routine, but maybe something's going to be a little different. Maybe because of the weather, and I know we try to not use the weather as an excuse to not go outside, but sometimes it can be something that keeps us from doing so. Giving them a heads up early on that, oh, maybe today we're not going to be able to go outdoors, or maybe today we're not going to be able to explore this part of the forest. Or maybe today we're going to have somebody new coming into the classroom. Those things are important to really help children know what's coming. I know maybe some of us like surprises, but some of us might not. And typically those of us who might not like surprises as much might be because surprises in the past haven't always been fun. And we have to remember the same thing may be going on in a little one's mind if they've experienced some trauma, especially for things like single incidents or events that they didn't anticipate coming. Being able to know that some change might be ahead is going to really help them get through the day better. Also providing age-appropriate choices, really giving them the opportunity to choose things that they want to do or materials that they want to use. And finally, we want to be able to, as educators, anticipate those moments during our day that children may be having a little bit more rougher time through. Children with trauma can sometimes have a difficult time when change is coming. And I noted that earlier in talking about when something happens, typically part of the daily schedule. But when you have children who might have difficulty with transitions, and I remember that with my own children in my classroom, there were a couple who just couldn't move from one activity to the next very smoothly. Being able to, knowing that and being able to kind of be present and being able to provide that extra support during those times really helped not just that transition period, but really as the rest of the day, being able to give them that smooth movement from one thing to the next house. So in this slide, you're going to see kind of a screenshot of a video called Sowing Seeds, Trauma-Informed Practice for Anyone Working with Children. And we're not going to show this video, but just wanted to kind of highlight it as a really excellent resource that you can use for yourself. Definitely a great way to kind of review some of the information that we've talked about. But even those of you who maybe are directors or oversee programs and want to be able to share some things about trauma-informed practice with fellow educators in your program or even the families you serve, this is a nice short video that really captures those ideas, and it even gives you examples of children across time. So you're going to see how trauma can affect a younger child, but also compared to a little bit older child and a teenager. And I think that's important to keep in mind because trauma is something that doesn't really go away. It's something that stays with us. And depending on the types of support that we get over time, is how we respond to it. So being aware that it's going to affect children in different ways at different points in their lifetime is really important to be aware of. So this video will be included among the resources on our presentation website for you to look at.
And this is concluding our presentation. As Sylvia had mentioned, we will have our resources linked in as well. And also you will be able to connect with us if you would like, if you have additional questions, as this is a pre-recorded presentation. We have provided our contact information, so feel free to connect with us in any sort of way.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.